Facebook, Google, all major tech companies are relying on Redis to increase performance and speed of their applications. In this video, I will be covering everything Redis, from what it is, how it works, the basics of Redis, and how to implement Redis into your application. You might be wondering, what exactly is Redis? Well, Redis is an in-memory database which runs completely on your machine's RAM, random access memory. But don't mistake speed for simplicity. Redis is a powerhouse, supporting a wide range of different data structures, from strings to lists to different types of indexes. But how does Redis work? As it's an in-memory database, which means it relies on caching. But the first thing to know about Redis is that it's also a NoSQL database, but it's completely different from other NoSQL databases like MongoDB. The reason is that it's a JSON structure, so it's completely dependent on key value pairs. Now, this makes working with Redis a complete breeze compared to other kind of databases where you're going to be working with intricate tables of rows and columns. The best way I can explain it is just think of Redis as a JSON table. But there's a catch, and that's because Redis runs on the RAM of your machine. So if your computer crashes, you will lose all the data that Redis currently has. And that's because RAM is volatile. So while Redis is ultra fast and can retrieve data in milliseconds compared to other types of databases, it is not a good long-term solution. So you'll still want to use other databases for the everyday transaction of data, but use Redis for pieces of data that you need extremely fast. And because RAM is extremely accessible, that is why Redis is a top choice for increasing your application's performance and speed. Now let's go over an example of how Redis might be able to fit into your application. Let's pretend your application is a middleware. An application calls your application, and then your application will call a third-party API endpoint, whether that's to fetch the weather, stock prices, anything you want. Well, you have no control over how fast that response comes back to your application to feed to the user. So what we're going to do here in the next application that we build is we are going to have a Redis database that stores the response from the first time we call the API endpoint. So then all other calls to our application will be able to fetch that data from Redis instead of always having to rely on the third-party API endpoint. So let's dive in and first go over how to install and go over the Redis basics, and then followed by an implementation of Redis in our application. Now, installing Redis is fairly easy. If you have a Mac, we can just use Homebrew and just do a brew install Redis. If you have a Linux, you can use the package manager of choice. But if you have a Windows machine, it's a little bit harder because you can't install Redis directly on the Windows operating system. We will have to use a subset of Linux that we can run inside of Windows to download Redis. It's fairly easy, and I'll leave the link below. So just to start off, I'm going to be doing this through a Mac point of view. But if you have Homebrew installed on your machine already, we can do brew install Redis. Now, what we can see is that we already have Redis installed, so we don't have to go through the entire download. So it's going to take a little bit longer on your side than mine, but I already have Redis installed. All right, now the very first thing you need to do is now run Redis on your machine. And we can do this by saying redis-server. Now, once you do this, we can see that Redis is going to start running automatically. It starts by running on the port of 6379. That's the default port for Redis. And now it's running, and the next thing we need to do is just open up another terminal. And inside this new terminal, once we already have the Redis server running, we can say Redis-CLI. And now we'll have Redis running, and we can save data, get data, do all the cool Redis things before we implement it into our application. But before we start, let's go over some of the main items that we're going to be saving and fetching and creating the key value pair relationship in our Redis JSON database. Now, the very first thing we can do is set a key to a value. So we can say set name. Now, setting the name is going to be the name. It's going to be the key. So we can say set name of Eric. Now, all this other stuff is just predefined stuff, so we can ignore that completely. I don't even really know why it's popping up, but we can just say set name Eric. We're going to get an OK response back. Now, if we say get name, that'll return Eric because, again, in our Redis database, name is the key and the value is Eric. So when we say get name, which is the key, it's going to return Eric. To see it again, we can say set OS to Mac and then get OS, which will return Mac back. So again, now in our Redis database, we have two keys, name and OS, with their values of Eric and Mac. If we want to delete a key value pair, all we have to do is say del and then pass in the key, which is going to be OS. So let's go ahead and just delete that. We can see that we got a 1. 1 is true, 0 is false. So we got a successful deletion. So if we try to get OS now, we're gonna get nil because the value does not exist in the Redis database. And we can check that by doing exists. So we can say exists OS, where we're gonna get 0 for false. But if we did the same thing for name, we can see that we're gonna get 1 because that's true. So 0 false, 1 is true. If we wanna see all the keys in our database, we can say keys and then just an asterisk. And we can see that we only have name currently in our database because we deleted OS. So if we want to set a new type of data, we can say set dog Milo, and that is my dog Milo. So now if we go ahead and say we want to look at all the keys, we can see that we have dog and name in our Redis database. Now, one thing we can do is type in TTL, which is time to live. So a good thing about Redis is since it's all cache and we are not using this as the main data within our application, we can set a TTL, which means the data will delete after a certain amount of time. Now, this is super helpful where in Redis you might want your data to be deleted every 24 hours. Because if you're fetching it from a third-party application, you might want to only fetch it once per day, save it in Redis to increase performance, and then delete it at the end of the day. So if we wanted to do this, we could say TTL name 10. And we can see that we're getting an error, and that's because the TTL command is not actually a command. But what we can say here is expire name 10. So what we're doing here is we are going to expire the key value pair of name within 10 seconds. So if we do this and then we say get name, we can see we have Eric, get name Eric, and here in a little bit, it will not exist. And we can see now that when I said get name that time, we get nil because Eric has been deleted after 10 seconds. When you create an item, we can create the item with the TTL already included. So we can say set expiration of dog 10 Milo. So now if we say get dog, we can see that we get the value of Milo, but then after 10 seconds, the value of Milo will disappear. So if we try it again, we now have nil because the value has been deleted. All right, so now that we got the basics of how the key value pairs are going to work, let's dive into our application and build a real life Redis application into our Python FastAPI. Now, the very first thing we need to do is pip install some dependencies on our application. So let's go ahead and just say pip install Redis FastAPI, Unicorn, and HTTPX. This will download all the dependencies that we need for our application. And a recap of what the application is that we are going to be building. We are going to be building a FastAPI application where when you call our FastAPI application, our FastAPI application will contact another application and then will return all of that data. So our FastAPI application is more or less just going to be a middleware here. So the first thing we need to say is from FastAPI, import FastAPI, from Redis, import Redis, import HTTPX, and then import JSON. We then now need to say app equals our FastAPI application. And now we need to have a startup, a shutdown, and then our application. So let's first start with our startup. So we can say app.onEvent, where we can say startup. We want this to be an async def startup underscore event, where we can say app.state.redis equals Redis, where we can pass in our host that is equal to localhost and our port, which is equal to 6379, which is the same port that we can see here. So if we go back to our Redis server, 6379 on our local host. We then need to say app.state.http underscore client will be equal to our httpx.async client. All right. Now let's do the same thing for a shutdown. So we can say app.onEvent, and inside here, we can say shutdown. We can say async def shutdown underscore event, which is app.state.redis.close. Now, what the startup and the shutdown do is that means when your application runs for the first time, we're going to connect to our app, our Redis environment, and our HTTPX, which we're going to be using as a library to call API endpoints from our FastAPI application. And then on shutdown, when we close our Redis application, we will also just close down that connection to our Redis environment. Now, the next thing we want to do is just create our API endpoint. So we can say app.get, and now inside here, I'm just going to call this our entries. Async def read item. And now we want to create a value. And the very first thing we can do here is say response equals await app.state.http underscore client dot get. And here I'm going to pass in a free API endpoint that's going to return a ton of data just so we can see how long it takes to call it. And this is going to be from https://api.publicapis.org/entries. And then I'm just going to return our response.json. All right, so let's run this application by doing a unicorn main:\app-reload. Let's now open up our application, say try it out, and click execute. And the first thing we can see is that it failed from our entries. So what we need to do here is go back to our application and make this a /entries. Let's reopen up our browser, click try it out and execute. And now we can see that it was calling that API. And it didn't seem like it took that long, but it's definitely taken a second or two. So if we had to call multiple of these, this would really slow down our application. But you can see that we're getting an absolute ton of data back. So we can click it again. We can see that it's loading, and I actually clicked it already. So 1, 2, 3. So it's taking about 3 seconds to get the results every single time. But now we can implement Redis to store all this data because we know that this data is the same at least for the next 24 hours. We can use Redis to save all this information, which will greatly increase the speed of our application. So if we come back into here, instead of just saying our response, we want to set a new key value pair in Redis. And what we want to do is say this value pair is going to be value equals app.state.redis.get, and we will name this entries. We then want to say if value is none, we want to do something. So right here, what we're doing is we're fetching it from Redis. So remember, get name, get OS, which is returning Eric and Mac. Get entries will return all the values for the key entries that we haven't created yet, but we just have that value looking. So we can say value equals app.state.redis get entries. If the value is none, well, that means we need to fetch it from the API and then save it within our Redis database under the key of entries. So this is good. If value is none, we want our response to equal that. We can then go ahead and say value equals our JSON response. So we know our value is now going to be equal to the JSON response that we get from the API. We can say data string because we need to be able to convert this data into a string to set it for a key value pair. So what we can say is data string equals JSON dumps, and we pass in our value. And so now data string is going to be the value of our JSON response in a string format, so we can save it to our Redis database. And then we can say app.state.redis.set. And now we need to say for the key of entries, we want to set the value of our data string. And then simply we want to return the value. So now if we come back to our application and we refresh, we can see that the very first call is going to be about that 3-second call. So if we click it, 1, 2, almost 3 seconds, and we get all of the data. Now that we saved this JSON data as a string, and we saved it to Redis now, next time we call it, it'll take approximately like 0 seconds. So execute, done. Execute, done. You see how fast it's flashing, the screen's flashing? And that's because we are getting the data from Redis this time instead of the third-party API endpoint. Now, one thing that we can also do is let's go back into this, and instead of just saying return value, let's go ahead and say return JSON.loads, and now let's pass in our value. Now, if we go back to our application and we refresh it and we try it again, we are going to get it in. We are going to fetch it the first time, and it's going to look like a JSON. It's no longer going to look like a string. And that's because our JSON.loads will transform our string into a JSON format on our Swagger application. So there we have it. We just added Redis to our FastAPI application to increase performance by, this is like 300 times, from 3 seconds to instant. And installing Redis and using Redis is not a scary task as many people think. If you want to keep learning about FastAPI, go check out this playlist, and I will see you in the next video.